Hello everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this video, we follow the emotional journey of Diep and James as they work hard to build a warm new home for their little girl, Nye. But just as they begin laying the foundation for their future, an unexpected figure from Diep's past reappears, her ex, John. Struggling with nothing left, John asks to stay in their old house, sparking a storm of jealousy in James's heart. Will James overcome his doubts, or will John's return threaten everything they've built? Stay with us until the end to witness how love and jealousy collide in this emotional chapter. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us. The car rolled slowly along the narrow street, weaving past old houses and small shops before pulling up in front of a tile store with a bright, inviting display. Diep pushed the door open and stepped out, her eyes immediately catching the rows of shiny tiles stacked neatly outside. James followed closely behind, his hand brushing against hers as if to remind her he was right there with her. Dark tiles will be easier to clean, Diep remarked, her tone carrying the kind of certainty only a mother could have when thinking of her child. She pictured little Nye running barefoot across the dusty floor, her feet turning gray within minutes. This renovation wasn't just about style. It was about giving her daughter a better home. The shop assistant greeted them warmly, guiding them deeper into the store. Rows upon rows of tiles gleamed under the soft fluorescent lights. Diep ran her fingers along the cool, polished surface of a deep brown tile. For a moment, she imagined it already laid across their living room floor. Nye's laughter echoing in the background. "This one's nice," she murmured. "But do you have it in stock?" The assistant hesitated before shaking their head. "It needs to be pre-ordered, about a week for delivery." Diep's brows furrowed. She hated the thought of delays. Yet James, ever calm, stepped in with a reassuring voice. "If it's urgent, we can place a deposit today." Their eyes met, holding for just a beat too long, before Diep nodded. There was an unspoken trust there, a silent agreement that every choice they made was a step toward building something lasting. As they left the shop, the late afternoon air wrapped around them, scented faintly of cement and fresh tiles. Diep exhaled deeply. Each decision they made was more than just about furniture or floors. It was about creating a foundation for Nye, about turning an old house into a true home. The next stop was a furniture shop, its interior bathed in warm light, the scent of freshly polished wood drifting through the air. Diep's eyes lit up as she gazed at towering wardrobes, each promising order and security. James trailed behind her, silently evaluating the durability and cost. "Only 2 types of wardrobes?" Diep asked. Her voice edged with doubt as her hand brushed over the surface of a light-colored one. It felt flimsy under her touch, and she shook her head. "This won't last." The assistant pointed toward another model, a faux wood wardrobe, larger and sturdier, nearly 9 meters tall and 2 meters wide. $3.5 million, he said. Free delivery included. James studied it carefully, his face unreadable yet deliberate, like he was measuring not just the money, but the long-term value it could bring. Diep's imagination painted a clear picture. Nye opening the doors, storing her little dresses, toys, and secrets inside. "This works," Diep finally said, her voice steady. James nodded, asking the assistant for the payment code. His movements were quick, efficient, like a man determined to provide. The scent of wood seemed to seal the deal. It wasn't just furniture, it was the promise of peaceful days ahead, a steady anchor for their family. As they walked out together, bags of receipts in hand, Diep felt something in her chest loosen. Each piece of furniture wasn't just an object. It was another stitch in the tapestry of their life together. But that fragile harmony shifted later that evening. Driving back toward the old house, the car slowed suddenly. A figure appeared ahead on the dusty road, familiar, yet out of place. James gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes narrowing. Diep froze. It was John. He looked different, his once confident demeanor replaced with a worn, fragile air. His clothes hung loosely on him, his shoulders slumped, and his face carried the weight of regret. "James? Diep?" John's voice cracked as he stepped closer. "I didn't expect to see you here." James's jaw tightened. "What are you doing here?" His tone was sharp, suspicious. John hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Diep before dropping to the ground. I just got out. My father sold everything to reduce my sentence. The house is gone. My family's broken. I have nowhere else to go." Diep's breath caught in her throat. Memories flooded back. John wasn't just anyone. He was her past, her old love, the man who once held her heart before everything fell apart. Standing before her now, he was nothing like the man she remembered. James's gaze darted to her, sharp and piercing. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken tension. John continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't deserve anything from either of you. But if you'd let me, I'd like to stay in the old house. I have nowhere else." The air grew thick, the golden sunset painting the road in fiery hues. James turned to Diep, his voice low, but edged with jealousy. "So, what do you think? Your ex-boyfriend back again. Do you really want him living here? So close to us?" Diep flinched, her heart torn. Compassion pulled her one way, while James's words cut the other. She looked at John, broken, lost, and then at James, who clenched the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "If he's really changed," Diep said softly, her tone carrying both hesitation and resolve, "then maybe we should give him a chance. The old house is empty anyway." James's head snapped toward her. "A chance? After everything? Or is it because it's him?" The bitterness in his voice startled her. "James," she began, but he cut her off. "No, answer me. If it wasn't John, if it wasn't your old lover, would you be so quick to forgive?" The words struck like a blade. Diep's chest tightened, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "This isn't about the past. This is about mercy, about doing the right thing." The car fell into silence, the weight of their argument hanging in the air. John stood by, head bowed, clearly hearing every word, but saying nothing. Finally, James exhaled sharply, his voice low and strained. "Fine, he can stay, but don't expect me to like it." Diep's shoulders sagged with a mix of relief and sadness. The fiery sunset framed John's silhouette, his eyes glistening with unspoken gratitude. Yet inside the car, the space between Diep and James felt colder than it had in years. As they pulled away, the road stretched into twilight. But inside James's chest, a storm brewed. He wasn't just jealous. He was terrified. Terrified that John's return might awaken old feelings in Diep, feelings James thought were buried for good. And for Diep, though she tried to steady her heart, she couldn't deny the truth. John's presence was stirring memories she had long locked away. The night air clung heavy as they returned to the old house. Its familiar walls stood in silence, the paint peeling, the wooden shutters crooked as though weighed down by time itself. Diep stepped inside first, her hand brushing the frame of the doorway, remembering the years she and Nee had endured here before everything began to change. James trailed behind her, his steps slow, cautious, his eyes constantly flicking between Diep and John. John carried a small bundle, just a few clothes and a torn notebook. His face remained lowered, his voice barely audible. I know this is asking for too much, but thank you. Even just letting me stay here. It means more than you'll ever know. Diep turned to look at him. Her heart stirred with empathy. She could see how far he had fallen, how much the world had taken from him. But James's jaw tensed, his fists clenching at his sides. You should be grateful to Diep, James said coldly. If it were up to me, you'd be out on the street tonight. John nodded, accepting the harsh words without protest. His humility only seemed to irritate James more. Diep sighed, sensing the fire building inside James. Enough, she said softly, her eyes searching his. He's here now. Let's not make this harder than it has to be. They moved into the dimly lit living room. The familiar blankets, pillows, and old aluminum pots were still scattered around, remnants of the life Diep once lived. For John, stepping into this space seemed both comforting and punishing, memories pressing down like invisible weights. I ruined everything back then, John said suddenly, his voice breaking. I broke us, Diep. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope for a chance to fix what little I can. His words cut the air sharply. James snapped his head toward Diep, his face clouded with suspicion. Fix what? James demanded. What is it you think you can fix? You think you can just walk back into her life after all this time? Diep's lips parted in shock. James! But James pressed on, his voice rising with raw emotion. You think I don't see it? The way he looks at you, the way you look at him. Don't deny it, Diep. Tears welled in her eyes. It's not like that. He's lost, James. He's asking for help, nothing more. Nothing more. James's laugh was bitter, hollow. Do you have any idea what it feels like to stand here and watch the man who once held you, who once loved you, step back into your life like he still belongs here? The room fell silent except for the shallow sound of breathing. John looked away, ashamed. James, Diep whispered, her voice trembling but firm. The past is gone. You are the one I chose, the one I built a life with, the one Nee calls father. Her words were meant to soothe him, but the ache in James's chest only deepened. He turned away, pacing, fighting an invisible war inside his head. His love for Diep burned fiercely, but so did the fear that she might slip away. Outside, the night deepened. The soft hum of crickets carried into the house as the three of them lingered in the heavy silence. Finally, James exhaled sharply and threw his hands up. Fine, he muttered. Stay here, John. But don't think for a second I'll ever trust you. John nodded, voice heavy with remorse. I don't expect you to. I only ask for a roof over my head. Diep looked at James, her heart aching. The man she loved stood before her, broken by jealousy, his pride wounded. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away, too consumed by his own storm. Later, as they left John behind with a few supplies, blankets, pots, and some food, Diep and James stepped into the car. The road stretched before them, but the silence inside was deafening. James finally broke it. Tell me the truth. Do you still love him? Diep's heart pounded. She turned her face toward the window, the passing shadows blurring. I loved him once, she admitted softly, but that's gone. What I have now is with you. The words should have soothed James, but doubt lingered in his eyes. Then prove it, he whispered, more to himself than to her. Days passed, but the tension did not fade. Every time Diep visited the old house to check on John, James's jealousy sharpened like a blade. He would ask questions. Where she'd been, how long she stayed, what they talked about. Diep tried to reassure him, but the shadow of John's presence hung over them like a storm cloud. One evening, James confronted her outright. Why do you keep going back? He demanded. Is it pity or something else? Diep steadied herself, her voice calm yet weary. Because it's the right thing to do. Because he has no one else. Because if we turn our backs on him, what kind of people are we? James shook his head. You're too kind, Diep. Too blind to see that he'll use that kindness to wedge himself between us. She stepped closer, her hand resting gently on his arm. James, listen to me. My heart belongs to you. It always will. But if you let jealousy control you, it will destroy us faster than John ever could. Her words pierced him deeper than anger ever could. He realized then that the real battle wasn't with John, it was with himself. The following weekend, as they shopped for curtains and paint for their new house, James caught glimpses of Diep's laughter, her energy, her dreams for the future. She talked about Nee's room, the colors she wanted, the little decorations that would make it special. And in that moment, James understood. This was his life, his family, his future. But still, doubt lingered. When they returned to the old house later that week, John greeted them with gratitude, his eyes tired yet calm. He had begun fixing the broken window, patching cracks in the walls, as though trying to repay the kindness shown to him. Watching him, James felt an unexpected pang. Not of jealousy, but of something else. Maybe pity, maybe understanding. You don't have to do all this, Diep told John gently. But John only shook his head. I need to. It's the least I can do. James stood in silence, torn. For the first time, he saw John not as a rival, but as a man beaten down by life, trying desperately to stand again. That night, as they drove home, James reached for Diep's hand. She looked at him, startled, but he held her gaze. I'm sorry, he said quietly, for doubting you, for letting my jealousy get the better of me. Diep's eyes softened, tears threatening to spill. James, all I ever wanted was for us to be a family. Don't let fear take that away. The moonlight spilled across the road as their hands intertwined, fragile yet firm, Behind them, the old house stood as a reminder of the past, a past Diep had long left behind, and James was learning to trust would never return. In the quiet that followed, James finally understood. Love wasn't about erasing the past, but about choosing the present, again and again. And Diep, glancing at him with a weary smile, knew that choice had already been made.